welcome to a very special International Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Robert M. Haddad, author of Defend the Faith with an exclamation point. He's coming to us live from our studios in Australia at Perugia Media. Welcome, Robert M. Haddad, to EWTN's Bookmark. Great to see you.
Great, thanks very much.
Now, Defend the Faith, exclamation point. Why an exclamation point?
Mainly because I'm very excited about the Catholic faith, and I want other people to be excited about it. In our experience here, in my experiences over many years, most people don't really know their faith well. And so I want to present it in a way that's exciting. It's not an angry exclamation mark, it's a happy exclamation mark.
Okay, very good. Now, you've got a whole series of titles that run all the way through almost 500 pages here. How did you come up with the various categories that you decided to speak about?
Well, basically, this book is based on my experiences over many years. Firstly, as a teenager, when I went to the Billy Graham Crusade in Sydney in 1979, that's when I made an important decision in my life to give myself to Jesus. So I had a lot of interaction with Baptists here in Sydney, then Anglicans, and it was my experience experiencing their questions over many years. And after I began to take my Catholic faith seriously in my early 20s and my engagements with other non-Catholics, it's those questions that form the basis of this book. So there's 50 chapters, but there's 166 questions, and so I can eventually put those questions under those 50 headings, starting with the Trinity and the Divinity of Christ and just moving on from there.
Now, this is a new and expanded edition, so when did you first put this book together, and how many editions are we talking about today?
Well, I began basically in the early 90s. The first 20 lessons, or the first 20 chapters, were actually my lessons that I used to use when I used to teach high school, years 7 and 8 kids, and I taught in a school where I had the freedom to actually introduce apologetics. So that's around 1990, 91. In the mid-90s, 94, 95, I decided, well, I want to introduce the Catechism of the Catholic Church into my lessons. So I began to redevelop all the lessons and just add to them. So it went from 20 to 30. And the first book that I released publicly was in 1996, and I began selling it in 97. Eventually it went to 36 chapters, then 40 chapters, and then to what we've got now, 50 chapters. So I basically look at this edition as the 5th and final version of the book.
I notice you punctuate final there. In the foreword of the book, there's a Father Peter Joseph, STD, who writes the foreword. He said, talking about apologetics, he says, for Catholics, it is the business of defending their faith against the many attacks launched against it today. All faithful Catholics should be willing and able to defend their faith. It's interesting the way he talks about the business of defending the faith. This is something we're really obligated to do, right?
Well, I believe so, and I believe it comes from our baptism and our confirmation. We don't have to be experts in theology, philosophy, or history, etc., to be an apologist. Everyone who loves God, Jesus Christ, who loves the Church and loves the Catholic faith, and who want to live it out, need to be prepared to give a reasoned explanation for it, according to the Magna Carta of St. Peter in his first epistle. And that's, I think, something I also want people to realise. Know your faith and be prepared to give an explanation for it.
Right, the truth that lies within, right. Exactly. Now, apologetics, that's a word a lot of people get confused by. They think it sounded like somebody's apologizing, which is not the case. But he also noted that apologetics fell upon hard times after the mid-60s, and that Australia, and I can tell you the United States as well, was not immune to this decline. Why do you think there was such a decline, and why do you see it coming back?
Well, the reasons for its decline are quite complex. The Second Vatican Council never used the term apologetics, but nevertheless made it very clear in its decree on the apostolate of the laity in paragraph 6 and in Lumen Gentium as well, that the baptized were still obliged to defend the faith according to the prescriptions of St. Peter, to give a reasoned explanation. I think because the mood in the mid-60s onwards was one about Irenicism and non-conflict, that people wanted to avoid clashes regarding religion. But what we did, we went to another extreme. We threw out bad apologetics, but we didn't replace it with anything else, when in fact the Second Vatican Council was laying down the foundations for a new apologetics. And it probably took a couple of decades after the council for people to realise that this was really the way forward. And it started in the United States, of course, with Carl Keating, as you know. It just gradually took momentum until eventually it reached Australia.
Yeah, it is interesting because you highlight the fact that a lot of it came out of the Carl Keating Catholic Answers, obviously the conversions of people like Scott Hahn and, of course, our own Marcus Grodi, in the sense of, and it actually spread and had an impact in Australia. And what's interesting, too, in the book, you talk about the fact that, you know, apologetics has been with us from the early days of the church. In fact, dealing with refuting attacks by pagan apologists who accused the church of being atheistic, cannibalistic, and sexually promiscuous. That one I hadn't really heard. The last one.
Yeah, that's because, well, sexually promiscuous, it was a misunderstanding of the Christians' love for each other. As Tertullian said, you know, the Romans were actually noticing how the Christians loved themselves so much, and those who were bad-spirited towards Christianity interpreted that to mean some type of incestuous relationships, etc. But it was the overflowing love of Christians that actually drew that criticism, unjustly, of course.
Right. You also pointed out one here, and in the beginning, including the trenchant anti-Christian scholar and philosopher of Tyre, and you can pronounce his name. His greatest work, The City of God Against the Pagans, took 13 years to complete and was aimed at refuting allegations that the calamities befalling the Roman Empire at the time, such as the sack of Rome in AD 410, were due to the abandonment of the pagan god. So that was a challenge to Christianity as well. And certainly later on, Gibbon was quick to claim that it was Christianity that softened the Roman Empire in such a way to be taken over by barbarians as well.
Well, to comment on the first person you quote, I think that's Porphyry of Tyre, and his works in the late 3rd century and early 4th century actually provided the intellectual basis for Diocletian's great persecution of Christianity. Right. And it took many decades or even centuries for Christians to fully respond to his writings. But what St. Augustine needed to refute was a very serious allegation, because even though Christianity was, by his time, the official religion of the Roman Empire, Rome had stood for over 1,000 years. And then once it became Christian, it only lasted for another 100 years or so afterwards. But that wasn't due to Christianity, of course. Christianity was one of the redeeming factors that probably kept the empire going when the moral position of people in the West, in particular, the depopulation of the Western Empire was the primary reason why it fell to the barbarians. Where Christianity was strongest in the Eastern Empire, that part of the empire was preserved and lasted for another 1,000 years, with the final ending of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century. Right.
You also talk about dealing with Julian the Apostate, and you also talk about the rise of Islam. A new apologetical opponent entered that arena, and even talking about St. Thomas Aquinas. So how do we see dealing with things like that today? I mean, you also talk about the Protestant Reformation or Protestant Revolt. Where do you see as the greatest challenges? You know, is it Islam? Is it still from Protestantism? Is it some form of Gnosticism, secularism? Where's it coming from?
Well, there's many challenges, and I think the rise of Islam in the West is a serious challenge that we need to contend with. But I think of all the many challenges that still occupy apologists today, my opinion, the most serious one is postmodernism, allied with secularism, the forcing of God out of the public arena, but also the denial of truth, the fact that the allegation or the assertion of postmodernists that there is no truth. We make up our own truth. Right. We make up our own identity. And I think this is what is of greatest concern in the West. And if there's no truth, then we can't have apologetics. So apologetics needs to re-establish the idea in the minds of people that there is a truth and that we can discover it and that we need to live it, to know it, to live it, to love it, and to defend it.
You talk about the relentless rise of atheism within an increasingly secular Western world has given added urgency for apologetics in defense of the existence of God, and you refer to it as the new atheism. How do you define the new atheism?
Well, the new atheism is embodied in the four horsemen of the apocalypse, so to speak, the Daniel Dennett's and the Richard Dawkins, etc., Sam Harris, and the other fellow who died recently in England, Christopher Hitchens.
Right.
Basically, the core of these four men is a poor philosophy. They do not understand Catholic theology, Catholic philosophy. They don't understand St. Thomas's 5 ways to defend the existence of God or to assert the existence of God. They misrepresent Catholic philosophy. They create a straw man version of Catholic theology and philosophy. They attack that, they ridicule that, and for the general public, it seems as if they have debunked Catholicism theologically and philosophically. But what we need to do is to reassert this traditional philosophical understanding of the proofs of God, to clarify them in the minds of people, and then hence to make a simplified version of them so the general public can see that there are good, solid arguments for the existence of God and that the claims of the new atheists are really unfounded.
Right. Another one you hit on very early on is the divinity of Jesus Christ, which is obviously central. Your objection, Jesus Christ was no doubt the Son of God, but not God the Son. And the thing that's interesting that you point out is that modern day denial of Jesus' divinity, and we hear that in, Jehovah's Witnesses and some other groups, but certainly in atheism, is the controversies of the 4th and 5th century, going back all the way to Arianism.
Well, look, the divinity of Christ has always been contested, but it's contested today in a different way. There are people who claim even to be Christian who deny that Jesus was God, and you've mentioned a few of those groups. And that actual question was based on a Christadelphian sign that I once saw outside one of their churches. But it's the modernist and the secular viewpoint that attempts to reduce Jesus to merely being some type of guru or some type of philosopher or some type of prophet maximum, that he was a sage of some sort, a wisdom figure, but no way was he God in human form. And this is prevalent, unfortunately, even within the church as well as outside of the church. So we still need to assert that Jesus was God in human form, that he did perform miracles, that he did rise from the dead. We have to re-establish the sacrality of Christ in the world.
Another point you make, you talk about original sin and the idea of why should we be getting blamed, the objection for what our parents did, so to speak. But you make the point that throughout history there's been several significant heresies that have either denied the existence or distorted the consequences of original sin. And you go on to talk about Pelagianism. I hadn't really thought of it in that way because I was thinking Pelagianism kind of as a works righteousness. What's the connection?
Well, I think what you've just said is more in the realm of semi-Pelagianism.
Okay.
Pelagianism at its core, originally, which preceded semi-Pelagianism, Pelagianism asserted that Adam and Eve were created in a natural state only, and that when they sinned, they did not fall from grace, and that hence they did not forfeit grace for subsequent generations. What they simply did was create a bad example for others to follow. So the redemption of Christ, according to Pelagius, is not the restoration of humanity in grace, but to provide a good example in opposition to Adam's bad example, and that we as human beings can naturally follow that good example. So that's also, you see there, the denial of God's grace inherent in that, because we need God's grace to be able to follow Christ's good example. But Christ did more than set a good example. Christ restored us to the Father and merited for us the restoration, a life restored in sanctifying grace. And of course we get that initially through baptism.
Now, you also say, and this was an interesting connection I had thought of, while Pelagius denied the supernatural elevation of man, Martin Luther in the 16th century went to the opposite extreme by asserting that grace was an essential part of human nature, not superadded to it by way of gratuitous elevation. Put that into everyday words. What does that mean?
Well, see, Luther and Calvin went to another extreme, the opposite extreme. They actually said that grace wasn't a gift, it was part of our nature. And when original sin occurred, our natures, we lost grace, but we were more than just wounded or damaged. We were left destroyed. We were depraved. And that depravity, or it's known as total depravity, not only ostracized us from God, not only meant that we lost grace, but destroyed our intellect so we couldn't know truth, and destroyed our will so we no longer had free will, but we were bonded in our will. And so that we can't cooperate with God in our salvation. God does it all through election. Now, there's some truth in that, but there's also there's an exaggeration and a distortion there, because we believe as Catholics that in our own personal salvation, our subjective salvation, is that we need to cooperate with God's grace and say yes to it, and we can say no to it. So we can resist God's will, but in the exaggerated understanding of original sin, we don't have a will to resist God. It's purely God's election, and that's the subtle danger here, that we still need, in some circumstances, to contest. And I still come across people in my own private apostolate and work who are these radical Calvinists, etc., who assert this exaggerated view of original sin.
Now, you also deal with justification and sanctification, dealing with the oft-heard question, are you born again? And you go through a couple of different versions. Do you have assurance of salvation? Do you know whether you'll go to heaven if you die today? And what's good about what you do is not only look at it and then to some degree respond to it, but then you also have citations from Scripture or from saints of the church, or understandings from tradition, or even many times quotes from, let's say, the Council of Trent that showed that that's not what the Catholic Church was teaching.
Well, see, I've got so many chapters on this issue is because of my own experiences. As I said earlier, being with Baptists and Sydney Anglicans, who are low church Anglicans, very evangelical, this came up all the time. And so I felt that there's an important need to put the Catholic position out there clearly. That's why we have a quote from the Council of Trent. I think many Protestants who encounter what Trent really said are surprised that it really does talk about that salvation is by grace alone, but that we need to respond. And how do we respond to God's grace? It's more than faith. It's faith, hope, and love. And I always put it in the picture like this, that our spiritual life is like a tree. It's rooted in faith, and hope are the trunks and the strong branches, and charity is the fruit. And when we're ultimately judged, we're not judged simply on the basis of whether we believed and had faith, but that we also that this faith was fruitful in trust, which is hope, and in love, charity. We can't be saved unless we love God above all things, and also love our neighbour as ourselves. So that loving of our neighbour as ourselves is not faith, it's a fruit of faith.
Okay, also you make the point here, and I thought this was good to point out to people, for both Luther and Calvin, Catholics taught a gospel of justification by good works. In response to the Protestant challenge, the Council of Trent formally declared as follows: if anyone says man can be justified before God by his own works, whether done by his own natural powers or through the teaching of the law, without divine grace through Jesus Christ, let him be anathema.
Well, that's right, and we need to show that the Catholic Church does not teach or preach a gospel of salvation by works. Our works are not our own, and this is going back to St. Augustine, responding to semi-Pelagianism. Our works are actually a fruit of our free response to God's grace. God, in a sense, really owns our work because he's the first mover, and this is what we call prevenient grace. He comes first, he inspires us, and we have to respond freely to God's grace. And if we do, God generously rewards us for good works done in faith that he himself inspired, that he was the author of.
Okay, and hell is eternal. In this section, you talk about the idea of people who say, well, that's an Old Testament mentality. How could a loving God condemn anybody to do that? And you make the point that the doctrine of an eternal hell today is assailed from both within and without the Catholic Church. Within the Church, there are Catholics teaching the modernist notion of quote-unquote universal salvation, which asserts that ultimately all will be admitted into the kingdom of heaven because God's mercy is so great that he could not allow it to be otherwise. So are you seeing a lot of that in Australia as well?
Definitely, and in the circles that I operate, in my professional circles, which is education, you have a lot of that, but you also have hell never been spoken about at all. And the quotes I've inserted in the book in this chapter surprised me because, in fact, Jesus and John the Baptist spoke about hell a lot more than we realise. But to make it clear here, our faith isn't a faith about avoiding hell. It's about getting to heaven. And in the end, hell is about God not sending us to hell, but God giving us what we chose. If we choose God and love Him above all things, we will be rewarded with Him. But if we choose to love ourselves above all things or other creatures above all things, that is the reward that God gives to us. And that's essentially is hell.
Mm-hmm. In dealing with answering Islam basic objections, you say part of the modern-day Muslim challenge is the explosion of Islamic apologetics against Christianity. So you actually see that kind of apologetic going on?
Well, see, in the part of Sydney that I live in is the most Islamic part of Australia. A very high percentage of a Muslim population, particularly Sunni and Shiite. And they're very active. Their youth is very active. And as a school teacher, I've actually lost a couple of ex-students to Islam. And I've engaged with Islamic apologists in a formal debate on one occasion and in casual encounters on other occasions. And the books that they publish are particularly aimed at debunking Christianity in general, particularly the scriptures, the Christian scriptures. And so there is a need there to re-establish the authority and the integrity of the Christian scriptures. There's a need to show what the Trinity really is, to explain that, to assert and to affirm the divinity of Christ, that is what he actually taught about himself, that he was God in human form, as well as the other quotes from scriptures, and to show and assert and affirm the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, and that the Holy Spirit is the paraclete promised by Christ and not Muhammad himself, because that's a big claim of Islam, that when we look at John 14, for example, when Jesus promises a new paraclete, that's not Muhammad, that's the Holy Spirit.
Right. Interesting. Let me ask you as well, in dealing with that, what have you found is, as you mentioned, some students of yours who ended up becoming Muslim, what was the attraction and what is the attraction, do you think, for, let's say, younger people who maybe were raised marginally Christian or have no faith? What is the attraction?
Well, I found with one of them, it's their solidarity. The boy that went to Islam found a friendship group. And Muslims can be very tight in their friendships. And that's a good thing, and we should have that as well. And when people stray from their own faith and they get into the wrong activities, the sex, drugs and rock and roll culture, and they tend to forget about their faith, it goes into the background, and they come across people who are fervent, who are faithful in a certain way according to their tradition, who show a lot of mateship and support to get them out of their difficulties. They tended to gravitate in that direction. And then they were introduced to anti-Christian arguments, particularly against the Trinity and the divinity of Christ and the authenticity of the scriptures. And that's what led a couple of these people out of the Catholic faith into Islam.
Okay. Now, obviously some of these, people can understand if they read through the contents, the things like the Crusades and the Inquisition, some of the black legends. How did the Jesuits get in there? What's the deal with them?
Well, because I've come across anti-Catholic literature in the past that really lampooned the Jesuits as an organization that was not only anti-Protestant in its foundations, but it was very conspiratorial over many centuries, and the Jesuits have been implicated in the Inquisitions and in other conspiracies against governments, etc., etc. So I wanted to highlight the great contributions of many, many Jesuits over the centuries. And as you can see in that chapter, there are many to highlight. And I've written another book with another chapter about great history, and the Jesuits figure so strongly in their contributions, not just to theology and philosophy, but to science and medical discoveries, etc. Quite astonishing over the centuries, their positive contributions.
So do you have any other books in the works?
Not at the moment. Defend the Faith is one of 10 books I've written. Another book that's very popular and that is being sold in the United States is through dynamiccatholic.com is 1001 Reasons Why It's Great to Be Catholic, which is divided into the 10 chapters, and it literally is 1001 reasons. And the biggest chapter is the chapter on miracles, which outlines 169 miracles, certified miracles that establish the authenticity, the truth of the Catholic faith, and miracles relating to the Blessed Sacrament, or miracles relating to the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the healings of Lourdes, etc.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We like to think EWTN is its
Welcome.
own little miracle here. Mother Angelica, and through the magic of technology, we are able to speak with you, Robert M. Haddad, author of Defend the Faith, coming to us from our studios at Perugia Media in Sydney, Australia. Thank you so much. It's great to have you with us.
God bless.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us for this very special International Bookmark. See you next time.